Greetings and good Wednesday morning, the 7th of June, 2023, third decade of the 21st century. If you're new to my channel, I always open with that to sort of kind of expose and call attention to the fact that it is in fact the third decade of the 21st century, to sort of kind of highlight we're in the third decade of the 21st century, and what sort of things are we discussing? What sort of things are popular? What is consuming the day-to-day life? What I will tell you is, between media, to include social media, they're very, very good at highlighting certain things to make it feel like that's what's happening everywhere, and I don't necessarily feel like that's the case. But in the spirit of a particular concept, yesterday was the anniversary of D-Day, the storming of Normandy and Omaha Beach and whatnot in Nazi-occupied France. And in addition to that, I was also listening to the Team Never Quit podcast, which was started by Marcus and, oh, why can't I remember his brother? They're twins, and his brother's a congressman. They both start with M's. Oh, I feel like such a turd. Morgan. Marcus and Morgan Luttrell and Marcus's wife, the Team Never Quit podcast. And they happen to have Eddie and his wife, Andrea Gallagher, on the podcast, discussing some of their ordeal when all of the legal woes happened to Eddie Gallagher. And I spent a little over 20 years in the United States Marine Corps, so if anything, the Marine Corps itself is my lane. Now, I was infantry, so I can't necessarily speak too intelligently about other facets of the Marine Corps, but at least being a Marine and being an infantry Marine and being a Marine from the 90s who migrated into the new millennium, the first decade and the second decade, where I retired in the second decade in 2015, that is my lane, and I can speak to that. If you've been into my channel before, you know that one of my theories is that we are the sum total of our decisions, and we are the sum total of our experiences, and those experiences and decisions, good or bad, have a tremendous impact on who we are and how we view the world, how we receive, interpret, and process information, and how we think and feel, and our thoughts and views on certain opinions. And this also goes out to my one loyal viewer, Stace Catalin, who we disagree on certain issues. Perhaps the greatest issue we probably disagree on is the concept of LGBTQIA+. We have some disagreements there, and one of the last videos I posted, perhaps some of the content was a bit much for her, so in the style of our upbringing, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And perhaps something I said was a bit too much for her to comment on while being emotionally neutral, and I completely understand. And, you know, that's where we do have our differences, and, you know, sometimes we can communicate, sometimes we can't. But it just is what it is. And, you know, if she does come back to the channel, it just demonstrates to everybody else there's a level of maturity that maybe our generation possesses that other people don't. And what I will tell you is I don't necessarily think it's generational. I think to just say that an entire generation does this consistently, I don't think is 100% accurate, because there are outliers, there are strangers to the norm, there are people who don't necessarily conform to all those things. But to some degree, I think you can also paint with a broad stroke and say, yeah, within certain demographics, certain generations, there are some commonalities. So where am I going with this? My lane and so on and so forth. Mrs. Gallagher, Andrea, said that she would love to speak to service members who were serving on active duty prior to 9/11, prior to, you know, the events that would eventually change the military and whatnot. And while I don't have the reach, and I don't ever expect her to see this, and I don't ever expect her to get in touch with me or comment on this, or her husband Eddie for that matter, I thought I would take the time to comment on this, and some of this, if you've watched my channel before, will be repetitious, and I apologize. So without further ado, so I graduated high school in the greater Chicagoland area in 1994, and as such, being a rather unexceptional individual, not very good grades, not a whole lot of athletic prowess. I joined the military. The recruiter told me that being from the state of Illinois would pay for my tuition and fees as long as I came back to Illinois after serving 4 years. Fun fact, it's not 4 years, it's 1 year of active duty service. Most military branches do not do a 1-year contract, but hey, whatever. So, and that's not specific to any race. That's anybody from Illinois. And there's 3 other states that do that. So that was very appealing, because back then in the 90s, you had to go to college. Mike Rowe wasn't where he is today. Mike Rowe wasn't necessarily touting blue-collar jobs back in the early to mid-90s like he is now. There's nothing against Mike Rowe. It's just back then I was part of that whole mindset where you had to go to college. I don't remember there being a focus on what you had to study, just that you had to go to college. And then even after that, when I joined the Marine Corps, a lot of my senior leadership always said, you know, just get your degree, because 90% of all employers just want to see that you're educated. And that stuck with me for a long time. But back to the point. What was it like serving prior to 9/11, and what was it like for 9/11 and going forward? Well, I'll tell you. From my personal experience, from the way I received, process, and interpret information, during the 90s, if you wanted to go somewhere and do something in the Marine Corps and have a nice set of ribbons to show for it, you had to be on the East Coast. You had to be stationed in Camp Lejeune, and you had to do one of the East Coast MEUs. It just seems like no matter what, one of the East Coast MEUs was always going somewhere and doing something and getting rewarded for it. If you were stationed in Camp Pendleton, you had to be a part of 1st Marines, where 1st Marines did the West Coast MEUs, and they didn't do as much as the East Coast, but they did more than everybody else on the Western Hemisphere. Otherwise, if you were in 5th Marines or you were part of 3rd Marine Division, like Recon and Force Recon, you did the 31st MEU. And the 31st MEU didn't do as much as the 11th, the 13th, and the 15th, but sometimes you got to go somewhere, sometimes you got rewarded for it. And then lastly, if you were in 7th Marines out in 29 Palms, or 3rd Marines where I was at, out in Hawaii, all we did was go back and forth to Okinawa, and occasionally you might go to mainland Japan, occasionally you might go to Korea, occasionally you might go to Thailand, and then in the most rarest of circumstances, during one of my deployments, we got attached to the 31st MEU as the 4th Rifle Company, the 2nd Helo Company. Now, I apologize for not taking the time to explain a lot of this military jargon and lingo. If you'd like a greater explanation, then just leave a comment asking a question and I'll explain it. None of it's classified. In fact, a lot of the terms have changed, so it's no longer classified anyways. So during my time in 3rd Marines, I did just under 2 years with 1st Platoon India Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. That's where I cut my teeth as a very young, green infantry Marine. Most of my senior Marines who had done a deployment before me were my age. They were all the class of 94 that went to boot camp right after high school and subsequently went to the School of Infantry, graduated ITB, and got to the fleet. So therefore they deployed in 95, maybe 95. So they were my senior Marines, but in all actuality they were mainly my peers. I didn't ship out until February of 95, and then long story short, after a stint in rehab and then a stint in grad hold due to my medical records and SRB and dental records being lost, I didn't actually get to the fleet until I had over a year in the Marine Corps. I didn't get to the fleet until I was done paying for the GI Bill. I didn't get to the fleet until I had already picked up E3 for time and grade, time and service. So I really cut my teeth with 1st Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. Back then, I think we were living up to everything the Marine Corps stood for. We were doing 30 miles a month. We would either do a 12 and an 18, or we would do 2 15s, but we were doing 30 miles a month. Mostly we did our hikes Thursday evening after field day going into Friday, so that we could have an early day on Friday, or what we call the Aloha Fridays. We did a lot of training in real basic jungle slash forested warfare, where we wore uniforms and we basically practiced tactics and techniques against another uniformed force operating in forested terrain away from the local population. And for the most part, we got really, really good at operating in our own backyard. Some of the training areas we would go to, and this will carry forward, we almost didn't even need a map. We just knew the area backwards and forwards. Most of it when I was in 3-3 was the same stuff day in and day out. We would create a defensive position, and then we would send out patrols from there. So we got really good at tactical camping, but we got really, really good at the basics. You know, patrolling techniques, dispersion, hand and arm signals, you know, how to shoot, move, and communicate. We were really good at the really, really simple stuff, and we were never invited to do anything more sexy. Occasionally, we would get to train in an urban environment where that was like super sexy. That's where we felt like, you know, SEAL Team 6 and Tom Clancy and whatnot, where we would have to practice room clearing. And what I also learned is operating in the urban environment is horrific, because the threats can come from damn near anywhere. You know, you talk about having your head on a swivel, you know, the threat could come from 360 degrees left to right, 360 degrees top to bottom. I mean, it's literally a sphere of influence where the threats could come from. After my first deployment, I would get transferred to 3rd Platoon Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. I didn't have enough time to go back on deployment with 3-3. 1-3 was a bit short-handed, so myself and a handful of others got sent over to 1-3. 1-3 did things a little bit differently, as I would come to find that, you know, units often take on the personality of their leadership. My company commander was phenomenal. My battalion commander was pretty damn good. But I got to them late. I got to them shortly before their evaluation exercises, which would always go on the big island of Hawaii. So, I mean, I got there like right before that. I didn't have any time with anybody. And for the most part, I wasn't treated altogether that well. But let me back up real quick to kind of provide some context. And I've mentioned this numerous times, so I apologize for the repetition. Part of my generation that we had to deal with and overcome was, I didn't go to boot camp until after Barbara Walters had done her expose on hazing in the military, with a major focus on the Marine Corps. So hazing was the zeitgeist topic of my generation, and it was also the scapegoat of my generation. You know, starting with my class of 94 and then pretty much layering down to anybody that could join the service prior to 9/11. So say from 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000 to 2001, you had about an 8-year stint where about the biggest thing we had to deal with was hazing, because hazing was a great scapegoat for lesser performing individuals, weaker individuals to, you know, claim. And then the other thing they had was, if they were desperate, some of the tools that they had at their disposal for individuals that didn't want to continue to do the military thing was, you could go UA, which basically meant you fled the base, you didn't show up for work, and then if you became a deserter after 30 days, that was a felony offense, and you could be tracked down and you could be incarcerated. Another one was, because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you could just say, hey, I'm gay, and then you'd be processed out for being gay. And then, of course, hazing. The problem with hazing was that you had to accuse somebody of it, and whether or not it was accurate or not, whether or not it was true or not, it potentially skylined and put other people in danger, and put other people at risk of losing benefits, at risk of losing a career, all because somebody couldn't hack it. Now, every once in a blue moon, it wasn't just crying wolf, it was legit and it was real. But the problem was, from our perspective, hazing was so liberal in its interpretation that it really came down to the command at whatever level, company, battalion, regiment, or higher, as to whether or not they felt it was legit hazing. So hazing was a big deal for my generation. Sorry about that, I had to take a quick drink. So we had to deal with hazing, and of course, a lot of our senior Marines, depending on what level they were at, we still had Vietnam veterans at perhaps the 05 level and above, and we had Vietnam veterans at the E8 level and above. Whether or not they had broken time, or whether or not it was continuous service, I don't know. Because by the time I came in 95, that was at least 20 years after 75. So you had to have been at a rank that would have allowed you to serve pre-75. I think most troops were pulled out by at least 73, 74. So, but pretty much all of our general officers, 1-star all the way to 4-star, were Vietnam veterans. Almost every one of our full bird colonels were Vietnam veterans, whether or not they were like in the shit or not. Most of our high-ranking sergeants major that were at least at the 06 command level and above were Vietnam veterans, and for the most part, most of our sergeants major were at least Vietnam veterans or were in the service during the time of Vietnam. First sergeants and master sergeants, you had a handful, and the occasional gunny that may have had broken time. But again, we were always accused of being weak or whatnot due to certain things that were unique about our generation. Because by the time our generation came around, the Pepsi generation, Generation X, we were sort of being encouraged to ask questions versus do what you're told without question. Some of us were much better at it than others, and I don't know if there's a tipping point where there's a generation of people that started to ask questions versus people who, you know, hey, eat this. Okay, what is it? Dog shit. Okay. So I think we were a bit more inquisitive, and I think there were certain idiosyncrasies about our generation. But where the rubber meets the road, where I think Mrs. Andrea Gallagher would be more intrigued to know, is a lot of our training was based on hypothetical enemies. So most of our plastic targets was that of like a Russian conscript at port arms like this, and they would, you know, they didn't move much. Occasionally you'd get to go to a range, a fancy range, probably an army-owned range where the target might move, so on and so forth. But we never fought against the insurgent. One of the commandants I had this concept of the 3-block war that didn't really last very long, but in concept it was full-blown combat in one block, humanitarian mission in the 3rd block, and then like a security operation in another block, or some variation. It's been a while since I've had to go over it, but basically in the urban area you can have 3 different blocks where there's 3 different things going on. That didn't last very long, but at the same time we still did a lot of what I would call static uniform training. Us in uniform against another force or service in uniform on neutral terrain or whatnot. Not a whole lot of urban tactics, and we certainly did not practice for IEDs. We did, because I was stationed in Hawaii, we dabbled very, very little in booby traps, but not that much. Because we would deploy to Okinawa, we would a lot of times go over, you know, some of the trade craft of the Japanese and whatnot, and every once in a while, since Vietnam was the last major conflict, with the exception of Desert Shield, Desert Storm in Somalia, and say Panama and Grenada and whatnot, Desert Shield being, Vietnam being like the last major prolonged conflict, most of our lessons came out of that. But we didn't really do a whole lot of booby trap training. So to kind of keep this moving forward, when 9/11 kicked off, a lot of us of my generation, if we were still in the service, we were at least on our second enlistment. We were at least E5s. Some of us were knocking on the door of E6. Most of us had not really been anywhere or done nothing, at least not to that magnitude. I mean, some of the East Coasters, and let me kind of frame that for you. Prior to 9/11, I'd kind of gotten tired of Hawaii. I loved it, but I got tired of going back and forth to Okinawa, and I thought if I was going to make a career out of the Marine Corps, I needed a change. So I jumped on a hot fill to a place called Bridgeport, California, a place I'd never been to, a place I knew nothing about. And to be quite honest, there was also a girl involved, so that had a lot to do with it. That didn't pan out, but I ended up going to Bridgeport, where it was a bit of a melting pot. We had guys from the East Coast, guys from 29 Palms, guys from Pendleton, both 1st and 5th Marines, and we had guys from Hawaii. Not as many from Hawaii, but like if you ever put us in uniform, you could see a stark contrast between the guys from the East Coast and the guys from the West Coast, and then of course all the senior guys that were already staff sergeants, E6s and above. You know, most of them had been in long enough to be somewhere where they went somewhere and did something. But again, at that point in time, the East Coast was where it was at. If you wanted to go somewhere and do something, even a humanitarian operation, you had to go there. So 9/11 kicks off, and at best, a handful of us that are about the same age had really not been anywhere and done much of anything. You know, maybe you went to a foreign country, did a humanitarian operation. Maybe you went somewhere where there was a threat level, and you know, you got to carry live rounds, and that was super sexy. But for the most part, as far as what we would eventually encounter in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had not been tested. So you got a lot of us that had made a decent living off of shooting paper, shooting plastic, and getting really good at supervising day-to-day life and leading day-to-day life, that now that there's a real conflict, we're going to be tested. Now, I'm kind of jumping forward a little bit because I really want to make this point. I don't want to ever come across as like I was the shit, that I was a tier 1 level operator, that I was the bee's knees, or all the things. But I'd like to think I performed better than some. That I recognized the fact that I'd been in the service for a significant amount of time before I finally got my combat cherry popped. And I've told this story a few times, but I'll say it again. When I crossed the border of Kuwait into Iraq with 2nd Platoon Gulf Company 2-5, I'd been in the Marine Corps for 8 years and about 2 months without being tested. All right, I was about 1/3 of the way through my career before I ever saw combat for the first time, and that would not be uncommon. I didn't really get a chance to talk to a lot of other people, but a lot of the guys that were E6s were my generation. They'd gone to recruiting, they'd gone to drill instructor duty, they'd gone to MSG duty, and they had all gotten promoted. I had some setbacks, so I was still in E5 while these guys were E6s. But we're all about the same amount of time in service, and we're all getting tested for the first time in combat. I won't give you any names. Some guys did really well. Some guys did as expected. Some guys did not do so well. And that also goes for some of the officer ranks. It's a hell of a thing to be in a position of authority, to be in a leadership position, and experience something for the first time as the people you're supposed to be leading. So you have to pretend like everything's normal. You have to pretend like this is old hat. This is nothing new for you, in order to make sure that these guys have confidence. And I don't know if I did a good enough job. Being in a leadership position sucks. It's oftentimes unpopular because, you know, you have to make some difficult decisions. You have to enforce certain things. Enforcing certain things is where you really earn your reputation, both good and bad. But I can tell you, from my perspective, it was nerve-wracking at first going into the invasion of Iraq, because I'd never been tested and I didn't know how I was going to perform. I just remembered in my head, I kept telling myself over and over and over. Back then, I don't know if the phrase existed, fake it till you make it, but I just kept telling myself over and over and over, at least just pretend. You know, just pretend. Hide your feelings, push your nerves to the back of your mind, and just do the job and rely on your training. And I hope I did a good enough job. But I remember what that was like. I remember the nerves and the anxious feeling and whatnot. I would eventually go to Iraq 2 more times. I would go to the Abu Ghraib, Karma area of Iraq, just outside of Fallujah, not Fallujah proper. It's kind of like, where are you from? Chicago. Well, Chicago, no. I'm from outside of Chicago, but nobody really knows outside of Chicago. So we were technically outside Fallujah proper. This was after the fight, the battle, the clearing of Fallujah had taken place, and that was with Weapons Company, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines. I was one of only a few combat veterans who'd actually been in some form of combat. I did not like how they were treating NCOs, which is E4s and E5s. There were at least 3 of us that had a significant amount of experience under our belt that were not being treated like I'd been treated elsewhere. Between Hawaii and Bridgeport, I was treated like a non-commissioned officer, and at that time in 3-8, I was not, and for reasons I don't know. I remember seeing some people in significant positions not live up to their expectations because they were being tested for the first time. They'd made a good career out of shooting paper, shooting plastic, you know, shooting blanks, you know, fighting an enemy that doesn't fight back, fighting an enemy that doesn't shoot, move, and communicate, not having to worry about improvised explosive devices. Improvised explosive devices was not necessarily a thing of the Iraq invasion. The Iraq invasion was mostly uniform or Fedayeen, but the enemy was more clearly defined, or at least it felt that way. And quite frankly, during the invasion of Iraq, if it threatened you, you dealt with it. Afterwards, the security and sustainment operations where we had to face the insurgency, that was brutal. So first and foremost, you got people who, for various reasons, did a tour, then went and did like a stationary tour, like recruiting or something else, and now they're coming back to the fleet, and it's like, hey, now that you've been in for a hot minute, you're going to get tested in combat for the first time. You better live up to the expected potential. You better live up to the rank and whatnot. And then we have these young kids that are coming right out of boot camp and, you know, infantry training battalion, and they're getting baptized by combat. So, you know, it produces a huge dynamic. Hopefully some of us lived up to our potential. Hopefully the majority of us lived up to the expectation, and the training paid off, and we did what was expected of us. It's just remarkable to see all the training we did prior and how useless most of it was. I mean, your basic patrolling skills, very little. It depended on where you were. In Iraq, specifically in the urban combat environment, your basic patrolling skills, from my experience, didn't really pay off as much because we were weighed down with more ballistic equipment than we'd ever trained with before. And due to being in somebody else's backyard in the urban area, you could not just la-di-da patrol, you know. You had to literally, like, okay, we're going to go here, stay there for a minute, we're going to go there. And I think one of the terms we used was bomb blasting. Like, you had to haul ass from position to position if you were overly exposed, because you were just ripe for the picking. It was like shooting, you know, fish in a barrel. At least that was Ramadi. My third deployment to Iraq was Ramadi, and you couldn't just, like, foot patrol. You had to, like, no shit. You know, if it was daylight hours after morning prayer, you had to, like, haul ass from position to position, get inside a courtyard, get inside a building, where if the enemy couldn't see you, it was much more difficult to engage you. In some of the areas we operated in 05, in the Karma, Abu Ghraib area, there was enough sparse vegetation spread out where you could do some patrols, and I know India Company did a lot of patrols. I don't know about Lima. Kilo Company at the beginning was charged with Abu Ghraib. I'm not trying to relive all the details of each deployment, but what I can tell you is a lot of the stuff that we trained to, a lot of the standards, a lot of the gear and equipment we had trained with prior to, say, Iraq and the subsequent operations that followed, in all honesty, it felt like it was, just like now you have to reset all of your training for the very specific things that you had to deal with in Iraq. The IED threat, the sniper threat, the vehicle-borne IED threat, the suicide bomber IEDs, whether vehicle, whether on foot or bicycle, the urban terrain, the amount of crap we had to wear to try to protect us, being mostly in vehicles, which we had never really done before. We'd never really trained in vehicles. I'm not saying the vehicles made us soft, but the vehicles added a level of protection and allowed us to cover greater distances in a shorter amount of time. I'm not saying it made us physically soft, but it added a different dynamic. I would eventually go to Afghanistan twice, once with a reserve unit, once with an advisor team. Afghanistan was way more spread out. It had everything from desert to alpine mountains to some urban terrain. In Afghanistan, the people there, be they Pashtuns or Taliban, they were more legit fighters. This was more like, instead of trying to battle the woke, social justice minded, urban hipsters, this was like being in the backwoods of somewhere, fighting the backwoods hillbillies. And I don't mean to use such awkward stereotypes, but Afghanistan was vastly different. And the fighting we saw in Afghanistan was vastly different. The tactics and techniques they used were more disciplined. Their shooting was more disciplined. In Iraq, it was a lot of spray and pray, which oddly enough worked out really well for them. A lot of RPG volley firing and a lot of IED warfare with the occasional sniper built in, which the snipers really did earn their paycheck. Their snipers were good because they would hit the target. We didn't see as much sniping as we did your backwoods hunter, who was just accurate with iron sights. The IEDs we saw in Afghanistan were way more ingenuitive. In Iraq, there was a lot of ordnance that was repurposed for IEDs. In Afghanistan, they were making, it's called HME, homemade explosives, but basically, if you think Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, they were making like fertilizer bombs that were big enough to pick up our armored vehicles and toss them. All right, they wouldn't necessarily generate, a focused blast using certain blast dynamics to like cut the vehicle in half. Basically what they did is they just put a whole bunch of shit together and hoped to God that it didn't wear out over time and that it just produced a big enough bang to produce the effects that they wanted. There were still the mines left over from the Russo-Afghan War, but Afghanistan was vastly different. And since I've been going for about 34 minutes now, I'll see if I can wrap this up. And this is both to try to answer Mrs. Gallagher's question, but also to kind of put a cap on what I'm sort of seeing with the military. So you have a lot of battle-born veterans, right? A lot of guys that came in because of the events of 9/11. A lot of guys that were born into combat. So from like E1 to E5, it was combat, combat, combat. And depending on where they were, they may have picked up E6, combat, combat, combat. And it was a very quick, rapid turnaround. So not to rewind all the way back, but prior to 9/11, we did a lot of dog and pony show stuff. We did a lot of wall locker inspections. We did a lot of uniform inspections. We did a lot of junk on the bunk inspections, and that was normal. That was part of the operation. That was just part of everyday life. They don't know what it was like to have a garrison training schedule where you could have close order drill on the training schedule, and we'd make fun. Like, we'd go out there and, like, one guy'd be like, all right, Simon says left face, right face. Oh, Simon didn't say, and we would do push-ups. And then, God forbid, somebody, oh, that's hazing. No, that's an agreed upon standard. If attention to orders, attention to detail. Why am I itching so much? Yeah, everybody can't wait to get out of the military and grow out their facial hair, and what they don't realize is it's actually more of a burden than it is. My family won't let me shave the facial hair. But I digress. So you had a lot of us that were used to pre-combat life. The long, drawn-out garrison schedules. The excessive weapons maintenance. The dog and pony shows. The having to get creative with classes and whatnot. To these rapid deployment schedules where all the training's laid out, so downtime was downtime. To where now it's going back to what it was like for us when we came in, and you have guys that have now earned senior leadership positions that don't know how to deal. They don't know how to deal with the dog and pony shows, the garrison life, the long times in between deployments. You're seeing kids joining the service that find themselves underwhelmed and disappointed. There's other reasons for that, but I can't really disclose what those are. And then, back in my day when I was much younger, the military most likely entertained a lot of nonsensical stuff, and sometimes when you're in the trenches, you don't see it, you don't feel it, and that's great. I think the hazing thing was like one of those things, but like now the military's dealing with a lot of nonsensical stuff. Certain leaders are trying to maintain their political relevance, so they're entertaining a lot of this woke nonsense, and they're entertaining a lot of these things that really don't have anything to do with the military. They don't serve a military purpose whatsoever. Like way back in the day when the Army was, debating and complaining over berets. Like, everybody in the Army is going to have a beret instead of certain units. Like back in the day, only the Rangers, the Green Berets, and Delta Force had berets for headwear. Everybody else wore a soft cover. And then I think if you were cavalry, you may have had like a cowboy style hat, but that way. And I'll never forget, like, Tina Fey was doing this thing on Saturday Night Live. It was like, these guys need a war. It's like, no shit. Back in my day, we used to joke about we need combat because combat is when common sense will prevail instead of some of the stupid shit we do now. For all the guys that got out before 9/11, I can tell you, combat did not open up the door to opportunity for common sense. All right, combat just added a new level of jackassery and buttfuckery to the mix. I apologize for being so long-winded about this thing, but it's my lane. It's what I can talk about. The older guys watching us younger guys and seeing some of the stuff coming in probably thought the same way that some of us do now, like the jackassery and the buttfuckery that the military is entertaining. It probably, goes in waves. To anybody younger that's still in the service wondering, if history repeats itself, if you stay in long enough, somebody's going to do something stupid, somebody's going to poke the bear, and our country will be involved in something else. If you believe in certain, I don't want to call them conspiracies, but if you believe in certain theories, democratic leaders and democratic policies give us weaker standing and weaker positions, and therefore it gives some of our enemies greater confidence to take action against us. So therefore it's probably not unfeasible to think that at some point in time in the near future somebody's going to get froggy and jump. So I guess if you stay in long enough, something will eventually happen. I couldn't give you a timeline, because there's plenty of guys that joined after Somalia, or were in basic training during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. Daughter had to ask me a question. As because I also got to get ready for work. Yeah, I think a lot of things go in waves. Certain things in the social zeitgeist, become trendy, and so on and so forth. What I will say is this: my generation was not really big on the gay thing at first, and it was a great source of humor. Oh, don't be gay, or that's gay, or whatever. In reality, I think don't ask, don't tell was a decent policy, because I look at it as nobody's business, who you want to be intimate with. The fact that people can serve now and be openly gay, I think is fine. One of my cousin's good buddies is gay, married to another dude, and they're just Marines. Because at the end of the day, and I've said this numerous times, there are certain things you have to do to be a Marine. You have to pass a physical fitness test. You have to pass a combat fitness test. You have to qualify with your weapon, be it a rifle or a pistol. You have to show up on time with a clean, neat, presentable uniform, with a clean, neat, presentable haircut, and a clean shave. You have to do your job. There's all these things you have to do that don't have anything to do with your sexual preference. And I think that's fine. The gay thing, guy on guy, girl on girl, bisexual, whatever. Adding additional labels, that's not my bag. Going further and trying to entertain other concepts, I think, is where the military is asking for trouble, because at the end of the day, what military purpose does it serve? Can somebody be gay and still do their job? Yeah. It doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden going to be in love with everybody in their platoon and rape everybody in their platoon or squad or fire team. Having talked to this gay individual, apparently that's not how it works. It's not that all of a sudden every man becomes an object to thirst for, or every girl becomes an object to thirst for. I think at the end of the day, a lot of sociopolitics infiltrates the military, it infiltrates military leaders, and they entertain some wildly inappropriate stuff, and they've probably always done that, and eventually it balances itself out. New political leaders are in place, new military leaders are in place, and they get back to the business of war fighting and being lethal and looking at what is absolutely necessary for the military force. As far as what it was like pre-9/11 for Mrs. Gallagher, it felt like there was more scheduling. It felt like there was more reliable scheduling. If you were supposed to do a MEU, you had a minimum of 18 months in between deployments. If you were doing UDPs to Okinawa, you had anywhere between 12 months to 18 months to 14 months in between deployments, depending on the unit you were in. And you could bet that there would be some consistency. There would be your boot drop, there would be your school phase, there would be your training phase, your evaluation phase, and so on and so forth. For the MEU, there'd be your schooling phase, and then there'd be your MEU schooling phase, and then there'd be your locking on for the MEU, and then working with the ships and everything, and training and evaluations, and then subsequent deployment. You'd also get your boot drops and whatnot. But I think in a pre-9/11 world, there was more regimented stuff. I think the best thing I could do is, without trying to rack my brain trying to think of specific stuff, because I've been going for almost 44 minutes, is to stop right there. And if anybody has any questions, if anybody has any comments or wants to add stuff to it, provide that opportunity for people to ask questions or leave comments, add stuff to this. If you're not familiar with my channel, I'm not big, I'm not monetized, I'm not making money off of this. It's just an opportunity for people to communicate with one another. So if you leave a comment, I promise I will read, react, and respond, and I appreciate it. And you're awesome. Until next time, stay safe out there.